Welcome to Eat, Sleep, Wine, Repeat, a podcast for all you wine lovers who, if you're like me, just cannot get enough of the good stuff. I'm Yanina Dor, your host, brand ambassador, wine educator, and sommelier. So stick with me as we dive deeper into this ever-evolving, wonderful world of wine. And wherever you are listening to this, cheers to you. Hello, wine friends. This episode is a deep dive into the Loire Valley in France using the WSET Diploma textbook as our guide. So this is part of my flashcard style series, which means I will ask a question, pause, and then give you the answer. And of course, if you want to play along, pause, think, and test yourself, perfect. Or you can just sit back and listen all the way through and it still works either way. This format is especially useful if you are studying for the D3 exam, Wines of the World. This is the big one. Or if you simply want to understand what is required to pass a high-level wine exam, or maybe you're just a wine geek who wants to go deeper into how wine regions really work. So we will be covering Loire Valley's climate, soils, grapes, appellations, and how everything connects in the glass. And if you've missed the other French deep dives, you can search for them. Episode 261 on Bordeaux, 253 on the Rhone Valley, and episode 246 for the Languedoc-Roussillon region. And there are also dedicated deep dives on sparkling wine and fortified wines for your exams as well. So if you cannot find what you are looking for, feel free to get in touch. Send me an email, Yanina, spelt with a J, Yanina at eatsleepwinerepeat.co.uk, but details are in the show notes. And if all this deep diving is getting a little too serious and you're more in the mood for wine fun, I also run bespoke wine events from home tastings to office sessions to virtual experiences. So just reach out and we can make it happen. So without further ado, let's get into the Loire. So the Loire has a really long history of making and trading wine, and that comes down to its location. It had easy access to the Atlantic Ocean. It was home to the French kings until Louis XIV, and it sits relatively close to Paris. Before railways existed, wine could be moved along the river, which made trade much easier. Now, talking of the river, the Loire River is actually the longest river in France. And along its length, you move through several very different wine regions. Starting inland at Sancerre, which is about 400 kilometers or 250 miles from the Atlantic, and then traveling downstream, you pass through Touraine, then Anjou-Saumur, and eventually reach the Atlantic in the Pays Nantais. Now, because the river stretches such a long distance, the climate changes from one area to another, and so do the grape varieties. So to show how different it can be, spring arrives in the Pays Nantais at least 2 weeks earlier than it does in Sancerre. Now, each area has its key grapes. In the Pays Nantais, the main variety is Melon. In the Middle Loire, meaning Anjou-Saumur and Touraine, the key grapes are Chenin Blanc and Cabernet Franc, although Touraine also grows Sauvignon Blanc. And then in the Central Vineyards, which includes Sancerre and Pouilly-Fumé, Sauvignon Blanc is the star, with a smaller amount of Pinot Noir as well. Okay, flashcard time. Let us start with Pays Nantais. Where is this region and what grapes should you know? So the Pays Nantais takes its name from the city of Nantes and sits close to the Atlantic Ocean. The main grape, as already mentioned here, is Melon, sometimes called Melon de Bourgogne or simply Muscadet. There is also a significant amount of Folle Blanche, known locally as Gros Plein. Now, Folle Blanche makes very high acid wines, and these are mostly sold locally and nationally. Now, the climate. What kind of climate does Pays Nantais have, and what challenges does that create? Well, Pays Nantais has a cool maritime climate Springs are cool, summers are warm and humid, and rain is a risk all the way through the growing season, especially in March and April, which can affect flowering, and then again in September during harvest. Luckily, soils are mostly well drained, which does help manage all the rainfall. And even though it is close to the Atlantic, spring frost is a major risk. In 1991, severe frost hit the whole region and production dropped dramatically, and that loss damaged what had been a booming export market to the UK. Now, frost has continued to be a challenge in recent years, so producers increasingly use frost protection like wind machines, heaters, and even burning straw bales. So why is Melon such an important grape here? So Melon has historically been the only permitted grape in Muscadet Appellations, although from 2018, basic Muscadet AOC can include up to 10% Chardonnay. Melon works well because it's hardy and it is suited to cool climates. It buds early, which increases frost risk, but it also ripens relatively early, reducing the risk of harvest rain. It can produce high yields and it has good resistance to powdery mildew. But there's a catch. There's always a catch. Its bunches are tight, so it's quite vulnerable to downy mildew and botrytis bunch rot, both of which love humid conditions. And because of this, vineyards often need repeated spraying, which of course can increase costs. So what style of wine does Melon produce? Well, think fresh, light, simple. Melon generally produces wines with high acidity, light body, low to low medium alcohol, and low aromatic intensity. Classic aromas are green apple, but many wines are made Sur Lie, which adds texture. We'll get onto that in a second. Quality is usually acceptable to good, with some very good examples, and prices tend to range from inexpensive to mid-priced. But how has vineyard management changed in the Pays Nantais? Well, because of humidity and disease pressure, growers monitor vineyards closely and spray where needed. Canopy management has improved a lot over recent decades. Canopies are now kept more open, and leaf removal is used to increase sunlight exposure and reduce fungal disease. But growers have to avoid sunburn on grapes exposed to afternoon sun. Harvest decisions also increasingly consider ripeness of skins and seeds, not just sugar levels. And in hotter years, sugar can build faster than skins and seeds fully ripen. So how is Muscadet usually made? Well, capitalization is allowed up to 12% potential alcohol and is used in cooler years. Fermentation and aging, they're usually done in large, shallow, underground glass-lined concrete vats, although stainless steel is also used. The aim is to keep flavours neutral. Malolactic conversion is usually avoided to preserve high acidity, and many wines are aged on lees, which again I'm going to talk about in a second. So more ambitious producers are experimenting now with things like skin contact and fermentation in barrel, amphora or concrete eggs, although these methods add cost. So let's get to the Sur Lie. What does it mean and why does it matter? So Sur Lie is one of the signature techniques of Pays Nantais. After fermentation, the wine is racked once to remove the gross lees. Then it stays on the fine lees through winter until bottling. And this gives more body to wines that would otherwise feel very light. So lees aging also helps preserve freshness and can leave a small amount of carbon dioxide, which is part of the style. Now, what appellations and wine laws should you know? The two major appellations are Muscadet Cerf-Humain AOC. That's the largest appellation in the Loire at 6,400 hectares, and Muscadet AOC. The smaller appellations are Muscadet Coteaux du Layon AOC and Muscadet Côte de Grandlieu AOC. Now, maximum yield for Muscadet AOC is 70 hectolitres per hectare. The other three AOCs and Muscadet Sur Lie are limited to 55 hectolitres per hectare. Typical wines are dry with low intensity aromas of green apple and grassy notes, high acidity and light body. Sur Lie can appear on labels across all four appellations, but there are rules. Sur Lie wines must be bottled between the 1st of March and the 30th of November of the year after the harvest, and bottling must happen in the winery where the wine was made. So that means negociants cannot buy wine to age Sur Lie. They can only buy grapes, must or already bottled wine. So what are Muscadet Cru Communaux? These are small, defined areas. They're often based on one type of bedrock, and they're created to raise Muscadet's profile. So examples include Clisson, Gorges, and Le Palais. If grapes come entirely from one area, that place name can be added to the label. These wines have lower yields, 45 hectolitres per hectare. They must stay on lees longer, so 18 months for Le Palais and 24 months for Clisson and Gorges. Because they are bottled later than Sur Lie rules allow, they cannot be labelled Sur Lie. The result, though, is wines that are rounder, more complex, and have longer finishes. So, final question on Muscadet. What happened to it commercially? So Muscadet was hugely successful in the UK during the 1980s, and vineyard area expanded to 13,000 hectares. But after the 1991 frost, it reduced production by 2/3. Prices increased, just as New World wines, especially Australian wines, became more popular. Today, Muscadet is repositioning itself as a source of high quality, terroir-focused wines with strong value for money. And exports account for about 15% of production. Negociants still matter, and they account for over half of sales, although less than before. Many smaller negociants have become absorbed into larger companies, and promotion for Pays happens together with Anjou-Saumur and Touraine through into Loire. So let's jump straight into the Middle Loire, and that is Anjou-Saumur and Touraine. So first question, what are the key grape varieties you absolutely need to know here? Well, the Middle Loire is basically built on two pillars. Chenin Blanc is the main white grape, and it can make everything from dry wines to off-dry wines to sweet wines and sparkling wines. Then for reds, Cabernet Franc is the star, and it also plays a big role in rosé wine. And just to add a small but important detail, in Touraine, Sauvignon Blanc is also a key white grape variety. So now let's talk about the growing environment. How does climate change across this region? Well, as you move inland from the Atlantic, the maritime influence slowly weakens. So in Anjou-Saumur, you still feel quite a strong Atlantic effect. But by the time you reach Touraine, the climate becomes more continental with colder winters and warmer summers. Still, it's not extreme like the Central Vineyards. Rainfall sits at about 700 millimetres across both areas, which is enough for vines, but the big issue is timing, because rain falls throughout the year and it can cause problems at key moments. Spring rain can disrupt flowering and fruit set, summer rain increases disease pressure, and rain in late summer and early autumn can seriously affect harvest conditions. So timing, not quantity, is the real challenge here. Now, why are vineyard sites so important? Because still wines here need full ripeness. So the best exposed vineyard sites are always reserved for still wines, while less ideal sites are more often used for sparkling wine production where full ripeness is less critical. Now let's add something tasty, sweet and rather special about Anjou. What creates the conditions for sweet botrytized wines? Well, in Anjou, the River Layon and its tributaries are key. They create those misty conditions in the vineyard at the end of the growing season, and that mist encourages botrytis, also known as noble rot, and that's what allows the production of botrytized sweet wines in this part of the Loire. But let's talk soils. What kind of soils do we find in Anjou-Saumur and Touraine? Well, there's a wide mix, including clay limestone, flint clay, sand, gravel and tuff. But broadly speaking, Anjou has more schist and limestone, while Touraine has more chalk. And the important shared feature is limestone, because limestone brings good drainage, but also good water retention, which is ideal for vine balance. However, there is a problem linked to all that lime in the soil, and that is chlorosis risk. So, to manage that, growers often use specific rootstocks such as Furcal and Riparia Gloire de Montpellier. Now let's focus on Chenin Blanc in more detail. What makes Chenin such a challenging grape to grow? So Chenin Blanc buds early, which means it is vulnerable to spring frost. It is also very vigorous, so if it is not controlled, it can produce very high yields. It is prone to powdery mildew and botrytis bunch rot, although that botrytis can be either a problem or a benefit depending on the style being made. It also ripens late, which means it can easily run into autumn rain, which is a major risk. Because of all this, top quality Chenin often requires multiple passes through the vineyard for selective hand picking. That limits the use of machines and increases cost, especially for sweet botrytized styles, which careful selection is essential. So what styles does Chenin make here? As you already know, as mentioned, it can produce sparkling wines, dry wines, off-dry wines, and sweet wines. The dry and off-dry styles typically show green apple and lemon fruit, sometimes with a steely or slightly smoky edge. They are usually medium alcohol and very high acidity, and in off-dry versions, there is often some residual sugar to balance that acidity. Quality can range from good and affordable wines all the way up to outstanding premium examples. Now let's move to Cabernet Franc. What are the main viticultural traits of this red grape? Well, Cabernet Franc buds early, so it also has frost risk. It is prone to couleur, which reduces yields. It is a mid-ripening variety, which is useful because it often gets picked before the worst autumn rains. But if it is not fully ripe, it can show strong leafy or herbaceous characters. Thankfully, though, improved canopy management like leaf removal plus warmer summers has reduced this green character in recent years. And it is also quite winter hardy, so it suits cooler climates. And what does it taste like? Well, Cabernet Franc in the Loire typically shows red fruit like red currants and raspberry, along with floral violet notes. It can also show that leafy character if underripe. Structurally, it is light to medium body with medium tannins and high acidity. It is used mostly for single varietal red wines and also for rosé blends. In eastern Touraine, where ripening is more marginal, it can even be blended with Côte, which is the local name for Malbec. Now, a quick look at other red grapes. What are they? So we have Grolleau Noir, mainly used in rosé blends, especially Rosé d'Anjou and Rosé de Loire. It is early budding, mid-ripening, and prone to botrytis. Gamay Noir is also early budding, so frost is a risk and it can suffer from poor fruit set in difficult weather. It has thin skins, so it is vulnerable to rot and wind damage, but it ripens early, which helps it avoid autumn rain. It is often made using carbonic maceration, similar to Beaujolais. The wines are pale purple with fresh red cherries, raspberries and plum fruit, sometimes kirsch-like with medium to high acidity, light to medium body, medium alcohol, and light to medium tannins. Cabernet Sauvignon also appears here, but it is late ripening, so it only really works in the warmest sites in Anjou. It is often blended with Cabernet Franc and also used in rosé blends. Now finally, winemaking. How are these wines typically made? For Chenin Blanc, fermentation is usually cool to medium temperature and can take several months. It is often done in stainless steel or large old oak. Malolactic fermentation is usually avoided and aging is done in neutral containers rather than new oak. The goal is always the same: preserve fresh fruit and high acidity. For Cabernet Franc, grapes are usually crushed and fermented in concrete or old wooden vats with punch downs or pump overs. Many producers use wild yeasts and aging is often in used oak barrels. Some higher end wines may see a smaller proportion of new French oak, but the aim is still to preserve fruit character. And for rosé wines, many are made by direct press, while some use short maceration. After fermentation, they're treated like white wines and aged briefly, usually around 3 to 4 months in neutral containers. All right, let's move into Appellations Wine Law and how everything is structured in the Middle Loire. And so, first question, does the Loire have a big regional appellation like Bordeaux? No, it doesn't. There is no single regional AOC like Bordeaux AOC. Instead, the Middle Loire is split into 3 regional appellations: Anjou AOC, Saumur AOC, and Touraine AOC. But let's break these down, starting with Anjou. What is its maximum yield? What is the Anjou AOC, the grapes, the blends? Well, Anjou AOC allows a maximum yield of 60 hectolitres per hectare for both red and whites. That's relatively high, and it can sometimes lead to wines with lower flavour intensity. For the blends, Anjou Blanc must contain at least 80% Chenin Blanc. Anjou Rouge must contain at least 70% Cabernet Franc and or Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, higher quality reds from specific areas are released as Anjou Villages AOC. This is only for still red wines, and they must be made entirely from Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon, either as single varietal wines or blends, although in reality, most are Cabernet Franc. Now, the yield is lower here at 55 hectolitres per hectare, and there is also a rule that the wines cannot be released until September of the year after harvest. So there is a built-in quality delay. Interestingly, some top producers in Anjou actually skip the AOC system altogether and label their wines as Vin de France, often for stylistic freedom. Now let's talk about one of the most important sweet wine regions, Coteaux du Layon. What grapes are used in Coteaux du Layon AOC? What are the sub-appellations and how does quality change? So this is a large appellation located on the slopes of the right bank of the Layon River, which flows into the Loire. It specializes in sweet wines made from Chenin Blanc affected by botrytis. And if botrytis doesn't develop, grapes may be dried on the vine instead. Now the key here is Chenin Blanc's high acidity, which balances the natural sweetness and keeps the wine fresh. There are strict rules here, especially for named village sites. Grapes must be picked in multiple passes through the vineyard, known as tries, to select only the botrytized fruit. The wine typically shows cooked citrus, baked apple, and honeyed aromas. They are sweet, medium plus bodied, medium alcohol, and high acidity. Quality ranges from good to very good, with medium to premium prices. But now, within Coteaux du Layon, there are two very important sub-appellations. What are Bonzo and Quart de Chaume? Both are small, high-quality sweet wine areas within the Layon zone. Bonzo has stricter rules than Coteaux du Layon, but less strict than Quart de Chaume. It produces wines with very high flavor intensity, rich texture, and typically sits at premium price levels with some super premium wines. But let's go one step further. Quart de Chaume became the Loire's first Grand Cru in 2019. At the same time, Coteaux du Layon Chaume became a premier cru. And as you move up the hierarchy, yields go down and minimum potential alcohol goes up, which increases concentration and richness. So here's the key progression. Coteaux du Layon allows higher yields and lower potential alcohol, while Quart de Chaume has the lowest yields and highest potential alcohol, producing the most concentrated wines. But for those of you testing your knowledge of maximum yields and the minimum percentage of potential alcohol per AOC, here you go. Coteaux du Layon AOC is 35 hectolitres per hectare maximum and 14% minimum potential alcohol. Coteaux du Layon AOC plus named village is 30 hectolitres per hectare and 15%. Bonzo AOC is 25 hectolitres per hectare and 15%. Coteaux du Layon AOC Premier Cru Chaume is also 25 hectolitres per hectare, but 16.5% minimum potential alcohol. And Quart de Chaume Grand Cru AOC is 20 hectolitres per hectare and 18% minimum potential alcohol. Now, a reality check. These delicious sweet wines can be difficult to sell because global demand for sweet wine is relatively low. And as a result, many producers are now making less sweet wines and shifting towards dry styles instead. So, let's move to Savennières AOC. What's the grape, the maximum yields, the smaller appellations within this region? Well, Savennières is a small but very prestigious appellation focused on dry Chenin Blanc. The vineyards sit on south-facing slopes with rocky schist soils and very low fertility. That combination gives low yields, high concentration, and strong ripeness. Now, these wines are very high in acidity and often high in alcohol. In the past, they were extremely austere in youth and needed many years of bottle age before becoming approachable. But things have changed with improved vineyard work and those warmer climates now. Many producers make styles that are still structured but more fruit-driven and approachable earlier. Maximum yields are 50 hectolitres per hectare, and some producers use a proportion of new oak for premium cuvées. Now, there are also those two important smaller appellations inside Savennières, La Roche-aux-Moines and Coulée de Serrant. These benefit from warmer Loire-facing slopes, giving riper fruit. They also have stricter yields at 30 hectolitres per hectare for dry wines. Coulée de Serrant is especially famous because it is a monopole owned and farmed biodynamically by Nicolas Joly, a major figure in biodynamic wine. Now let's shift into rosé production in Anjou-Saumur. What are the key rosé appellations? First, Rosé de Loire AOC. This can be made from Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Gamay, and Grolleau Noir. It is dry with a maximum yield of 60 hectolitres per hectare and can technically be made outside Anjou-Saumur, although it rarely is. Then we have Rosé d'Anjou AOC. This is mainly made from Grolleau, but also includes Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cote, and Gamay. The yield is higher at 65 hectolitres per hectare, which can reduce flavour intensity. But these wines are typically medium pink to orange in colour, with medium intensity red berry fruit, medium plus acidity, medium alcohol, and they are usually medium dry. I repeat, medium dry. They are inexpensive to mid-priced and range from acceptable to good, with some very good examples. Importantly, this is the most commercially popular rosé in the region. But there is Cabernet d'Anjou AOC. This must be made from Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon. The yield is 60 hectolitres per hectare, and the wines are typically a deeper pink colour and medium dry again. So, not bone dry, not dry, medium dry. Now let's move into Saumur AOC. What styles can be made here? Saumur AOC covers white, red, rosé still wines plus sparkling wines. White wines are made from Chenin Blanc. Reds are mainly Cabernet Franc. Rosés are blends of Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon. And the yields, well, they are quite high at 60 hectolitres per hectare for whites and 57 for reds and rosés, which can sometimes lead to lighter flavour intensity. There is also Coteaux du Layon AOC, which produces sweet Chenin Blanc from overripe grapes, sometimes with botrytis picked in multiple passes. Yields are limited to 35 hectolitres per hectare, and the wines are sweet and high in acidity. Now, Saumur-Champigny AOC is especially important. What are we looking at here? This is a red wine appellation made mainly from Cabernet Franc with a minimum of 85%. The wines are typically pale ruby in colour with red currant fruit, sometimes leafy aromas, medium alcohol, high acidity and medium tannins. Soils here are a mix of chalk, flint and clay, which gives good drainage and water retention. Maximum yield is 57 hectolitres per hectare, and wines can be released as early as December of the harvest year, meaning they are generally made for early drinking. Historically, these wines became very popular in Paris bistros from the 1970s onwards, helped by producers like the Sancerre and Bourg a cooperative now known as Cave Robert et Marcel. Most wines are good to very good and priced from inexpensive to mid-range, with a few premium examples like Clos ou Char. Now let's finish with Touraine AOC. You know the drill. What are the styles, grapes, yields, and appellations within this region? So Touraine AOC covers white, red, rosé, and sparkling wines, just like Saumur. But there is an important difference. White wines are mainly Sauvignon Blanc, while reds are mainly Cabernet Franc and Cote. Gamay is also important and can be labelled on its own like Touraine Gamay. Rosé can be made from many grapes, including the Cabernets, Cote, Gamay, and Grolleau. Touraine also allows subzones like Touraine Amboise. These reflect local variation in grapes and style. For example, Touraine Amboise Blanc is made from Chenin Blanc, not Sauvignon Blanc, and has lower yields, around 55 hectolitres per hectare, compared to 65 for standard Touraine Blanc. Now, let's focus on the key Touraine appellations for white and red wines. What do we have? Vouvray AOC is the most important white appellation in Touraine. It is made from at least 95% Chenin Blanc, although usually 100%. Maximum yield is 52 hectolitres per hectare. The best vineyards sit on slopes above the Loire with good sun exposure and river moderation of temperature. Soils are flint, clay, and limestone over tuff, giving good drainage. Dry Vouvray is made every year. Demi-sec is common. Sweet styles are rare. And unless it is clearly stated, it can be hard to know whether a Vouvray is dry or sweet just from the label. Across the river, we find Montlouis-sur-Loire AOC, which makes very similar wines from Chenin Blanc, also with a 52 hectolitre per hectare yield. Montlouis has become very dynamic in recent decades, with many organic and biodynamic producers due to lower land prices compared to Vouvray. Now, the red wine appellations of Touraine. Bourgogne AOC focuses on Cabernet Franc, with up to 10% Cabernet Sauvignon allowed. Maximum yield is 55 hectolitres per hectare. Wines range from light to structured depending on site and yield. Saint-Nicolas de Bourgogne AOC generally produces lighter styles than Bourgogne, but with similar pricing and quality ranges. And finally, Chenin AOC, which is the most famous of the three. White wines from Chenin Blanc and Rosé wines are also made, but it is mainly red wine made from Cabernet Franc, again with up to 10% Cabernet Sauvignon allowed. Wines range from light, fruity, early drinking styles made with short maceration to powerful, structured wines made with long maceration that can age for decades. Now, soil matters a lot here. Sandy soils give lighter, earlier drinking wines, while clay limestone gives more structured and age-worthy styles. Most wines are made to be drunk young, but the best structured examples can age for 20 years or more. And just to finish everything off, both Anjou-Saumur and Touraine export just under 20% of their production. Anjou-Saumur produces around twice as much wine as Touraine. Rosé production in Anjou is more than 10 times rosé production in Touraine, and significantly more sparkling wine than Touraine, whereas Touraine makes significantly more white and red wine than Anjou-Saumur. All right, now we head all the way east in the Loire to a group of appellations called the Central Vineyards. And yes, this is where things get very Sauvignon Blanc focused, very precise, and very site driven. So first question, What exactly are the Central Vineyards and what are the most famous appellations? Well, the Central Vineyards are a group of 8 AOCs located in the far east of the Loire Valley. They're called Central because they sit roughly halfway between the source of the river and the Atlantic mouth. The two most famous names here are Sancerre and Puy-Formé, and they also have the largest vineyard areas. Now, we know Sauvignon Blanc grows here. What about the red grape? Well, it's Pinot Noir for the red and rosé wines. But let's talk climate and growing conditions in a bit more detail. What is the climate like in the Central Vineyards? It is now fully continental. So you get cold winters and warm summers, but there are some key risks. Spring frosts are a major threat, and summer hailstorms can also cause damage. Even though it is continental, rainfall is around 750 millimeters per year. That's important because it reduces drought stress, but it also increases fungal disease pressure. So you've got a balance here. Less drought risk, but more disease risk. Now, here's something really interesting about the light. Because this region sits quite far north, the growing season has long daylight hours, but the light intensity and heat are relatively low. And that combination leads to wines with more restrained, subtle flavour profiles rather than very overt fruit. Now let's move to the key grape varieties. What is Sauvignon Blanc like here? So Sauvignon Blanc is absolutely dominant in the Central Vineyards, making up about 80% of plantings. Viticulturally, it is late budding, which helps avoid spring frosts, but it is also relatively early ripening, which is useful in a cool climate with a risk of autumn rain. It is a vigorous vine, so it needs to be planted on poor soils and carefully managed in the canopy. If the canopy is too dense and shaded, the wines become overly green and underripe. And it is also prone to powdery mildew, botrytis bunch rot, and trunk diseases such as Esca and Eutypa dieback. Now, the flavour profile is where things get really recognisable. What should you expect? Well, in the cooler conditions, Sauvignon shows grass, bell pepper, asparagus, gooseberry, grapefruit, and even whetstone notes. In warmer conditions, you can move into more passion fruit and riper tropical fruit styles. Structurally, these wines are typically medium body, medium alcohol, and high acidity. And one key point, vineyard decision really matters here. Row orientation, canopy management, and especially picking date all influence the final style. More shade means more green pepper character, more sun means more tropical fruit, and picking too late can lose acidity and freshness. Now let's briefly cover Pinot Noir. What is Pinot Noir like in this region? So Pinot Noir makes up about 15% of plantings in the Central Vineyards. It produces wines that are typically medium ruby in colour, with light to medium intensity, red fruit like raspberry and strawberry. They have high acidity, medium alcohol, and tend to sit in the medium price to premium range. So overall, think lighter, fresher Pinot styles compared to Burgundy, but still elegant and expressive. Now let's move into winemaking. How are white wines made in the Central Vineyards? So, fermentation temperatures are usually slightly higher than in many New World Sauvignon styles. So instead of a very cool fermentation, it sits in the upper cool to low mid range. The goal is not explosive fruit, but more restrained expression. Malolactic fermentation is often blocked to preserve acidity, although some producers allow it depending on style and vintage. Some higher quality wines are aged in old oak barrels, not to add oak flavour, but to build texture and body. For example, in Sancerre, François Cotta uses old oak and long lees contact to create wines designed for aging. Meanwhile, producers like Henri Bourgeois may include a more obviously oaked style in their range, showing there is stylistic diversity even within the same appellation. Now, let's go into appellations, starting with the most important one. What is Sancerre AOC? Its size, the grapes, yields. Sancerre is the largest and most commercially successful appellation in the Central Vineyards. White wine must be 100% Sauvignon Blanc. Reds and rosés are made from 100% Pinot Noir. Now, historically, this area was mostly planted with Pinot Noir, but after phylloxera, it was replanted largely with Sauvignon Blanc. From the 1950s and 1960s onwards, Sancerre wines were successfully promoted, first in Paris and then across France and internationally. Now, the vineyards sit on steep slopes between 200 and 400 meters, and they're protected by surrounding rivers and forests, which help reduce spring frost risk. Maximum yields are relatively high, 65 hectolitres per hectare for white, 63 for rosé, and 59 for red. Sauvignon Blanc can still produce good flavours at these yields, but Pinot Noir needs lower yields for concentration. Typical Sancerre white wines show grapefruit, gooseberry, medium alcohol and high acidity. They rarely show new oak. Quality ranges from good to outstanding, sitting at mid to premium price levels, with a few super premium examples from top producers like Didier Dagenot and Francois Cotta. Now, what about the soils in Sancerre? There are 3 main soil types, and they are absolutely key to style. First, caillotte. These are very shallow limestone soils. They produce the most aromatic wines, which are approachable early, but less suited to long aging. Second, terre blanche. These are Kimmeridgian limestone and marl, the same as Chablis. They are slower ripening and they produce more structured wines with greater aging potential. Famous sites like Côte de Mont-Damnay and Col de Beaujeu sit here. Third, silex. These are flinty soils that retain heat, leading to earlier ripening and wines with smoky, stony character. Now let's move across to Pouilly-Fumé AOC. What is going on over here? So, Pouilly-Fumé is also 100% Sauvignon Blanc with the same maximum yield as Sancerre. However, it sits on flatter land, which makes it more vulnerable to spring frost. Because of this, some growers use wind machines for protection. Soils are broadly similar to Sancerre, but the style tends to be slightly different. Pouilly-Fumé wines are often a bit rounder and less aromatically intense than Sancerre. They also often need a little bit more bottle age, usually 6 months to a year before they fully open up. Now, a quick run through of the other Central Vineyard appellations. What are they? Rouillé AOC produces Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, and Rosé from Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir, with similar yields to Sancerre. Quincy AOC is white wine only, mainly Sauvignon Blanc with a small amount of Sauvignon Gris. Menetou Salon AOC produces the same range as Sancerre, but its vines sit on gentler slopes and are more exposed to frost risk. These 3 appellations generally produce good to very good wines at inexpensive to mid-priced levels. Now, you do not need to know the final 3 for your WSET diploma, but hey, I am just going to drop these in here for fun. Yes, I said for fun. Sur Lie AOC. This is a distinct appellation in the same area as Pouilly-Fumé, but dedicated entirely to the Chasselas grape. Then you have Coteaux du Layon AOC, located along the right bank of the Loire, producing Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, and Gamay. And then Châteaumeillan AOC. This is the southernmost appellation in the region, specializing in fresh red and rosé wine known as Vin Gris. made from Gamay and Pinot Noir. And finally, one last important point. Unlike many famous wine regions, there is no formal cru classification system in the Central Vineyards. However, single vineyard bottlings are becoming more important. Well-known sites include Le Mont d'Amnay in Chavignol and Le Belle Dame in Sancerre, showing that site expression is becoming more and more important. And the appellations of the Central Vineyards promote their wines together via the BIVC, the Bureau Interprofessionnel Vin de France. All right, so the regions, grapes, soils, and appellations are now all done. So just to finish off, let's add a few final pieces that help you understand how the Loire actually works in the real world today. In the Loire Valley, family-owned estates are still absolutely central. Many producers are proud of how many generations have worked the same vineyards, and that history really matters here. It's very common to find estates that have stayed in the same family for a long time, quietly building reputation over decades. At the same time, there's also a steady flow of people moving out of big French cities like Paris and choosing a completely different life, setting up small wine estates in the Loire and becoming producers themselves. So you get this interesting mix of deep tradition and fresh energy. Now, alongside all of that, negociants play a huge role. In fact, around 50% of Loire wines are sold through negociants. The top 10 negociant companies alone account for more than 80% of that sector. So it's quite concentrated. Estates directly sell about 41% and cooperatives are just under 10%. But here's something interesting. The line between negociants and estates is not what it used to be. So over the last couple of decades, it's become a little blurred. Many negociants now vinify wines themselves rather than simply buying finished wine. Some even own wineries spread right across the Loire, from the Pays Nantais all the way to Sancerre. And some have also bought prestigious estates. For example, Grolleau de France owns Château de Fessel in Bonzeau and Château de Clairey in Muscadet Serve-Iman. Ackermann owns Château de Varennes in Anjou and Château de Sancerre. At the same time, many family estates have started their own negociant activity. This has become even more common recently because of frost and hail damage, which can seriously reduce harvest size. So buying in grapes, juice, or wine can help estates stay financially stable and keep customers supplied. Exports make up around 20% of total sales, and the main export markets are the United States, the UK, and Germany. And one really important point here, Sancerre stands out in exports. It outperforms all other still wine appellations in both volume and value, and it sells at a significantly higher average price than most other Loire white wines. So even within the region, there are clear commercial leaders. And last but not least, the Loire Valley has become a very important centre for organic, biodynamic and natural wine production. Nicolas Joly is one of the most important figures here. I mentioned him earlier, and he helped found the movement known as Renaissance des Appellations, also called Return to Terroir. This is now a global biodynamic group, but the Loire has more producers involved than any other region. Organic certification overall is slightly below the French national average, which makes sense when you think about it. This is a cool, damp climate where disease pressure is high, so farming organically is more challenging. But despite that, the Loire has become a real hub for natural winemaking, with many producers choosing minimal intervention and often releasing wines as Vin de France rather than more restrictive appellations. And that is it, my friends, on the Loire Valley. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Loire Valley. following the WSET Diploma textbook. Now, if your brain feels just a little bit full right now, that means you have earned yourself a glass of wine. So go grab one. Now, next week we are heading to northern Italy, to the Alto Adige region. This is going to be, I promise, a much softer, funner, slightly dangerous episode coming up, because after listening to Edouard Bernard, who is the director of the Alto Adige Wine Consortio, you will be wanting to book a ticket immediately. But before we go, as always, a wine quote said by Julia Child, an American chef best known for bringing French cuisine into American homes, and she said, "Just like becoming an expert in wine, you learn by drinking it." So we've just done the learning with the brain, but now it's time for the learning with the mouth. And that's where the joy comes in. So if you are studying hard, do not forget to enjoy a glass of wine, share it, pair it with some good food, and let it slow things down for a moment. And if you are enjoying these episodes or finding them useful for your studies, please do leave a review on Apple Podcasts, drop a rating on Spotify or wherever you are listening, and share it with a fellow wine lover. Genuinely helps the podcast grow and keeps this podcast going. Right, go easy on yourself this week. Let a few things settle and let the knowledge do its thing in the background. Until next week, wine friends, cheers to you.